A quiet neighborhood, a family home, and a case that would transform an ordinary community into the center of a major criminal investigation. In early 2025, Jamie Brock and Kristen Brock were found dead inside their home in Carroll County, Georgia. What investigators discovered that morning would lead to months of questions, evidence review, and a legal battle that continues to attract public attention. How did a family tragedy become a homicide investigation? What evidence would shape the direction of the case? And how would investigators attempt to piece together what happened inside that home? This is the Sarah Grace Patrick case. Every criminal investigation begins with questions. Sometimes those questions are answered quickly. Other times, investigators spend months collecting evidence, reviewing information, and reconstructing events to understand what truly happened. In this case, authorities examined forensic evidence, digital records, witness statements, and other information as they worked to build a timeline. As details became public, interest in the case grew. News reports spread, discussions began online, and many people searched for answers. But in any criminal investigation, separating confirmed facts from speculation is essential. In this documentary, we will examine what has been publicly reported, what authorities have alleged, and what remains part of the ongoing legal process. It is important to remember that allegations are not proof, and the court process is responsible for determining the facts. Before we continue, if you enjoy carefully researched true crime documentaries that focus on facts, investigations, and the stories behind the headlines, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We are working toward reaching 50,000 subscribers, and your support helps us continue creating more investigations every week. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Long before the headlines and courtroom proceedings, the Brock family lived a life that appeared ordinary to those around them. In Carroll County, Georgia, Jamie Brock and his wife Kristen Brock were raising their family while managing the everyday responsibilities of work, school, and home life. Kristen's teenage daughter, Sarah Grace Patrick, was also part of the household, along with the couple's young child. Like many families, their days were filled with routines that often go unnoticed. School schedules, family responsibilities, conversations at home, and plans for the future. To neighbors and members of the community, there was no public indication that the home would later become the center of a homicide investigation. But everything changed when emergency responders were called to the residence. On the morning of February 20th, 2025, authorities arrived at the Brock home after receiving a report of a serious incident. Inside, investigators discovered that James Brock and Kristen Brock had been fatally shot. The discovery immediately changed the nature of the investigation. What first responders encountered was no longer just a family emergency. It was now a case requiring detectives, forensic specialists, and investigators to determine exactly what had happened. The first hours of a homicide investigation are often some of the most important. Investigators secured the scene, documented the home, collected evidence, and began the process of reconstructing the timeline. Every detail had to be examined carefully. The location of evidence, the movements of people connected to the home, the events leading up to the discovery, and any information that could help explain what occurred. As detectives worked, the community began searching for answers. Friends, neighbors, and people familiar with the family expressed shock over the deaths. The case gained attention beyond the local area as investigators continued gathering information. At this stage, authorities had many questions, but few public answers. Who was responsible? What led to the shootings? And what evidence would eventually reveal more about what happened inside the home? The investigation was only beginning. Behind the scenes, detectives were building a case file, one piece of information at a time, and the evidence collected during those early stages would become central to everything that followed. According to publicly reported information, the events that unfolded inside the Brock residence during the overnight hours would become the focus of a complex homicide investigation. Inside the home that night were Jamie Brock, Kristen Brock, their young child, and Kristen's teenage daughter, Sarah Grace Patrick. When investigators arrived, their first responsibility was to secure the scene and begin determining what had happened. In a case like this, detectives do not immediately have all the answers. Their work begins with collecting information, preserving evidence, and carefully examining every detail available. The first questions investigators needed to answer were basic but critical. What happened inside the home? When did the shootings occur? Who was present? And what evidence could help explain the events of that night? The home itself became one of the most important pieces of evidence. Investigators examined the layout of the residence, the locations of the rooms, and the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the victims. Public reports noted that the bedrooms were located close to one another, making the home's layout an important part of understanding the possible timeline of events. In homicide investigations, the physical environment can provide important information. The distance between rooms, the location of evidence, the condition of the scene, and other details that may help investigators reconstruct what happened. Detectives worked to document the residence carefully, collecting evidence and creating a record that could later be reviewed during legal proceedings. As news of the case spread, questions surrounding the deaths continued to grow. Family members publicly shared their concerns and discussed details they believed deserved further examination. However, statements from family members or individuals connected to a case represent their personal views and are not automatically established facts. Those questions would eventually become part of the larger legal process, where evidence would be examined and arguments would be presented by both sides. For the community, the tragedy left many people searching for answers. Neighbors struggled to understand how a family home could become the scene of such a serious investigation. Memorials were created, messages of support were shared, and attention surrounding the case continued to increase. Behind the scenes, investigators continued gathering information. Forensic evidence, digital records, interviews, and other investigative materials all became part of the case. As authorities worked through the evidence, the investigation moved beyond the initial response and into a much longer process of analysis and review. Every homicide investigation has a turning point, the moment when investigators believe they have gathered enough information to take the next legal step. But reaching that point requires time, evidence, and careful review. In this case, that next step would eventually come when authorities announced criminal charges. That announcement would change the direction of the investigation and move the case from the crime scene into the courtroom. Questions surrounding the Brock home were no longer only about what happened that night. They became questions about evidence, responsibility, and the legal process that would follow. The next chapter examines the developments that led investigators toward criminal charges and how the case moved into the courtroom. As the investigation continued, detectives moved beyond the initial response and began examining the evidence collected from the Brock residence. A homicide investigation is not solved by one single piece of information. Instead, investigators often build a case by combining many different sources of evidence: forensic findings, witness accounts, digital information, and the timeline of events. Each piece must be carefully reviewed. Each detail must be compared. And every conclusion must be supported by evidence. Investigators continued reviewing the circumstances surrounding the deaths of James Brock and Kristen Brock. They examined the crime scene, analyzed available records, and conducted interviews as they worked to understand what happened inside the home. In complex investigations, detectives often look for answers to several important questions. What events happened before the crime? Who had access to the location? What information can be confirmed through evidence? And what details require further investigation? These questions help investigators separate facts from assumptions passed. Modern investigations often rely heavily on technology. Digital evidence can include information from phones, computers, online activity, and other electronic sources. Forensic evidence can include materials collected from a crime scene that may help investigators understand what occurred. However, evidence must be carefully analyzed and interpreted. A piece of information by itself may not explain an entire event. Investigators must consider how multiple pieces of evidence connect together before reaching conclusions. After months of investigation, authorities announced a major development in the case. Criminal charges were filed, moving the investigation into a new phase, the legal process. An arrest or criminal charge represents an accusation by authorities. It does not determine guilt. From that point forward, the evidence collected by investigators would be examined through the court system. The prosecution would be responsible for presenting its case. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the evidence and present its own arguments. Once a case enters the courtroom, the focus shifts from investigation to legal proceedings. The court process is designed to examine evidence, hear arguments from both sides, and determine whether the prosecution can prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. For the families involved, the courtroom can become another difficult stage of an already painful situation. For investigators, it becomes the moment when months of work are placed under examination. Evidence that was collected during the investigation may be reviewed, witnesses may be questioned, and the details of the case may be discussed publicly for the first time. As the case moved forward, public interest continued to grow. News organizations followed developments. Online discussions increased, and many people began forming opinions based on the information available publicly. However, public discussion and legal findings are not the same thing. A courtroom relies on evidence, testimony, and legal standards, not speculation or online opinions. That distinction is especially important in cases that receive widespread attention. Even as the legal process moved forward, important questions remained. What evidence would become most significant? How would both sides present their arguments? And what conclusions would ultimately come from the courtroom? Those answers would depend on the evidence presented through the legal process. The investigation had brought the case to court, but the court would determine what came next. The story of the Brock case moved from a family tragedy to a homicide investigation, and finally into a legal battle where evidence would be examined in public. In the next chapter, we look at the courtroom proceedings, the arguments from both sides, and where the case stands today. After the investigation moved forward and criminal charges were announced, the case entered a new stage, the courtroom. Unlike an investigation, where detectives gather information privately, court proceedings take place through a public legal process. This is where evidence is examined, arguments are presented, and both sides have the opportunity to challenge the information being presented. For the prosecution, the goal is to prove the charges through evidence that meets the legal standard required by the court. For the defense, the responsibility is to challenge the prosecution's claims, question evidence, and present its own arguments. The courtroom is where accusations are tested, not through public opinion, not through online discussions, but through evidence and legal procedure. For the families affected by the case, the legal process represents another difficult chapter. Behind every investigation are real people dealing with loss, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. The deaths of James Brock and Kristen Brock left a community searching for understanding. Friends, relatives, and neighbors wanted answers about what happened and why. But criminal cases often take time. Evidence must be reviewed, legal arguments must be considered, and the court must carefully examine the information presented before reaching a conclusion. Cases that receive national attention often create strong public reactions. People may form opinions based on news reports, social media discussions, or limited information released during an investigation. However, the legal system requires a higher standard. Evidence must be presented. Witnesses may be questioned. Arguments must be evaluated, and decisions must be made according to the law. This process exists to ensure that conclusions are based on facts established in court. As of the latest publicly available information, the Sarah Grace Patrick case remains part of an ongoing legal process. Details may continue to develop as hearings, evidence reviews, and court proceedings move forward. New information may provide additional context, while some questions may remain unanswered until the legal process reaches its conclusion. For that reason, it is important to follow verified updates and avoid treating rumors or speculation as facts. The Sarah Grace Patrick case is a reminder of how quickly an ordinary situation can become the center of a major investigation. Behind every headline are people, families, investigators, and communities searching for answers. The evidence collected, the testimony presented, and the decisions made through the court system will ultimately determine how this case is remembered. Until then, the search for truth continues. Thank you for watching this investigation and taking the time to understand the facts behind the headlines. If you appreciate true crime documentaries that focus on research, storytelling, and the details often missed in the news, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new investigation. We are working toward reaching 50,000 subscribers, and your support helps us continue creating detailed documentaries every week. If you have thoughts about this case, share them respectfully in the comments. What questions do you think still need answers? And if you know someone who follows true crime stories, share this documentary with them. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next investigation.